Welcome. Come on in. If you're getting pizza, definitely get pizza. If you have not signed in using the QR code, please make sure to do that. Also, on your tables, there is a QR code in red for an evaluation. So at the end of this event, if you would please click on that and fill out that evaluation. That does help us plan future events. Again, welcome. My name is Sarah Reed. I teach history here at the Northeast Campus, and I'm going to introduce our speakers today for our event called Voices of Resistance. So on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and World War II begins shortly thereafter. But as with all great events in history, there is a backstory. In the years between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, countries like Germany and Italy underwent significant political change. Authoritative totalitarianism in the form of fascist regimes developed in both countries, emphasizing the state, extreme militarism, anti-Semitism, and aggressive control of the people. In these ultra-conservative states, the fascist parties defined whom they considered citizens and whom they did not, what they considered appropriate culture, how they believed the people should behave, and what populations they considered superior. Anyone fitting into a group deemed inferior or resistant to the policies delivered by these fascist dictatorships faced violent backlash. Concurrently, Germany and Italy focused on military buildup in part to create the image of a powerful state, but also so that they could march those armies into other countries. By 1939, the German army was 7 times what it had been, far surpassing typical peacetime numbers. By the time the United States joined World War II in 1941, the map of Europe looked formidable, with Axis occupations of Poland, Norway, Greece, and part of France, to name a few. Part of World War II's history involves civilian populations and their devastation and experiences during the war. In each of those occupied nations, men and women rose up in resistance against the occupiers, sometimes violently, and other times in more diminutive yet powerful ways. Today, we learn of 2 forms of resistance from our speakers, Professors Haley Stewart and Adam Guerrero. Professor Stewart will talk about the French resistance, which begins after the German invasion of France, early in the war. Professor Guerrero will talk about the Greek resistance, beginning after the Italians, then Germans, occupied that country. Both discussions will demonstrate how important the people's involvement was to the ultimate defeat of the Axis powers, highlighting the strength and resilience of those who stood up for what they believed was right in the face of extreme challenge. So please help me welcome Professors Stewart and Guerrero as they tell us about Voices of Resistance.
Before we get started, I just want to tell you about why there's these chickens that are stuffed and sitting here on the front of the stage. We have 2 of our advisors for our Knit and Crochet Club in the Department of History, Samantha Elkins, and the one who just introduced us, Professor Sarah Reed. And they always try to create something as kind of a giveaway when we do these talks. So at the end, if you're still here, because you have to be here to be present, Professor Elkins will use the sign-in sheet and draw names, and you can win chickens. And there's also little whales right here. Now, you might be like, why chickens? Anybody watch football, not American football? Right? And if you know about France, chickens. And it's the speckled chicken. Okay, so that is where those come in. Another thing I want to do before we get started, because we're going to kind of tag team this, and we have a little bit of a thematic organization where we can talk about some commonalities and back and forth of what's happening in different parts of Europe. But I want to read you a couple quotes, one from a French resistor and another from a historian of the French resistance. But I want to kind of get you in the right mindset of what civilian resistance is about, what it's meant to do. So the first one is from a former resistance member in France named Henri Maru, and he says, "At bottom, we always believed that our role was to fight on the domestic front, the front of spiritual resistance to Hitlerism, so that the military victory would not be in vain and tragically illegitimate." Jacques Semelin, who is a French historian, says that civil resistance was one of survival, aimed at saving what could be saved, without necessarily waiting for the reversal of military power relations. The aim of civilian resistance was not so much to defeat the occupier, it did not have the means to do so, as to exist beside it, in spite of it, without waiting until the eventual hour of deliverance. And I wanted to get us in the right mindset because I think sometimes we assume a resistance movement is supposed to coup a government or overthrow some occupying power. And it's much bigger than that, and it's not capable. It's like, you're not going to be able to defeat a military that is the best military in the globe, that is the most advanced military in the globe. But that doesn't mean you can't be the sand in the gears, and it doesn't mean that you can't break it down in other ways, right? So we're both going to start off by kind of introducing the beginnings and give you all kind of an overview, context, if you will, so that we can talk about things more specifically. Women in the resistance, Jews in the resistance, things like that. So I'll start by giving you a little context about France. And so the German army, or the Wehrmacht, which is what the German army is called, will invade, the Netherlands, France, in May of 1940. And like I said earlier, the German army is the best army in Europe, hands down. This is why everybody assumes all the other armies in Europe are weaker armies. But it's not that they're weaker armies, it's that the Germans have the most technologically advanced military in Europe. They have been developing it in secret. And all of the allied powers, whether it's the British, the French, the Americans, are going to have to figure out how to fight that army. So for America, that will be the invasion of North Africa in 42, and where they will get some training and experience. To add to that, the French army is in no shape to defend against an invading force like the Germans. World War I had wreaked havoc on their military, and the infrastructure, they'd lost a very large number of a whole generation of men. And so the fight isn't going to be a very strong fight. You probably maybe have heard of Dunkirk because they've made movies about Dunkirk, but this is part of, the British Expeditionary Force and some French forces trying to evacuate the continent so they can live to fight another day. But in France, the Prime Minister of France is Marshal Philippe Pétain, and he is a World War I hero, right? He had made his name in World War I, and he will be the one to surrender to Germany in June of 1940. Now, because of this surrender, that is why they will divide France. The northern part of France will be occupied by the Nazis, by the Germans, and the southern part of France will be called the Vichy regime because they will be located in Vichy. But it is essentially a puppet regime where Pétain is at the head of that government. Now, this bottom picture is Charles de Gaulle, and he is technically in exile in London. And on the 18th of June, before you have the official French surrender, he will give a radio broadcast from London where he will declare himself the leader of the Free French. And so he will situate himself as being the oppositional figure to Pétain and the Vichy government. Now, he's going to use radio to communicate, which is going to have some strengths and some weaknesses. I have some numbers for you. The problem with radio as a form of communication for de Gaulle and the Free French is that not everybody in France has a radio. So you probably have 5 million radios in France in 1939, and during the war, there's roughly 1.5 million that will be added. To compare that, the UK had approximately 9 million radios, and Germany will have 13.7 million radios. Now, Germany is larger because of Joseph Goebbels, who is the propaganda minister for the Nazi regime. He will really push radios hard as a form of, sending messaging and propaganda out to the masses. So this means not everybody's going to hear de Gaulle's call to resist the German occupation, and so not everybody is going to be receiving his messages at the same time. But he is going to try to become the leader of this, but the resistance is not unified. And I think that's something you have to always keep in mind. It's not unified for the war at all, really. You have lots of different groups, lots of pockets of resistance. You get more unification toward the end of the war and really post-invasion of Normandy in 1944, because then it's a more concerted effort to liberate cities. And so you have people who hate de Gaulle. You have people who will use de Gaulle because he's useful and all of that, but that doesn't mean that he really truly is the leader of Free France, even though he is positioning himself to be so. So this is a map that kind of demonstrates what France will look like. So the northern zone, or the resistance in the north, will be German occupation. So generally speaking, there will be fewer organizations in the north, but they will be more unified, right? Because they are resisting Germans in a different way. You have a lot of resistance groups who will move to the south because it is Vichy, and this doesn't mean that Vichy isn't harsh or that they won't crack down on people because they are a puppet regime for the Germans, but it is a little bit easier to remain elusive to those people who are capturing you. So this is how it is. And if you see the dark red, this is what we call the Atlantic Wall, because the Germans will build massive military buildup along the coastlines, which is why your D-Day invasion in 44 is so harsh, is so terrible. So this is resistance south and resistance north, and then in your rural areas of France, they called all those groups, generally speaking, the Maquis. So these are people who are fighting in the rural areas. They're using their terrain, mountains, other types of things. And you see the most militaristic response from those rural areas with combat. So let us introduce the Greeks.
All right. Good afternoon. How's the pizza? Good. All right, so if we read this quote from Winston Churchill, if you know anything about your history, again, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this time, he says, "From henceforth, we will not say that Greeks fight like heroes, but that heroes fight like Greeks." He's saying this because the Greek resistance at this time actually is one of the largest resistance movements in Europe under Nazi and other fascist regimes. In fact, if you look at the history of Greece, I don't think that the Greeks and the Italians really understood what they were getting into, because it is a history of resistance. They've been doing this since the 15th century. They've been fighting the Ottomans. All these various groups we're going to be talking about, they all were already well established. And so what we see is when the Italians, if you know much about your World War II history, in the Mediterranean region, mostly the Italians were trying to take over much of the Mediterranean, and you see the Nazis are pushing eastward, as was introduced in the beginning, with the invasion of Poland. Now, when they break their agreement with Stalin, which I'm surprised that Stalin actually made an agreement with Hitler, you see he's pushing further into the east, Operation Barbarossa. But here's an interesting fact. The Greeks, as you see with the Italian army pushing in, they actually have a really hard time subduing the Greeks, and I'll hopefully kind of show you why here a little later. There have been some who've argued that it's because of that resistance why the Germans eventually had to kind of splinter off a little bit, bring some forces from Operation Barbarossa actually to push into Greece, because they can't afford to have the Greek islands, they can't afford to have the Greek peninsula being taken by the Allies. And so they actually, well, I've heard some argue that that kind of saves the Soviet Union to an extent because they had to divert those resources. So again, we see them pushing in from the north, and I know the map doesn't show it, but you see not just into the peninsula, but also into the various islands, also into Crete, which we'll talk about those movements. Now, when we talk about resistance, much like what Professor Stewart was saying, it's not just armed conflict. Right? Yes, there's going to be active resistance. We'll see fighting take place, sabotage, but there's also that civil disobedience, right? And we're going to be talking about those various groups that actually were involved in this. Now, in the beginning, what you see is they kind of just they'll revert to their old ways, right? Much of those who were in power, they hightail it out of Greece, similar to what we saw with the French. They will end up going to Cairo in Egypt because, allies are there, it's safe, and many of your military officers are going to flee. And so what we see in Greece is it's left to those local resistance movements, and we'll talk about the various different groups. And it is important to know that these groups did not like each other even before the Nazis and others came in. Now, they will see that they need to cooperate, right? That whole the enemy of my enemy is my friend mentality. They're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to get along sort of just to, achieve this end. But afterwards, we're going to see also that becomes a problem. How are we going to proceed with rule after we kick the fascists out? Next slide, please. So we have several different groups. Now this one, again, is one of the largest resistance movements. Most people don't think about Greece. I bet you if I ask every one of you, you probably know about, say, the movie Valkyrie, right? Most people know about what was happening in Germany. France, people talk about quite a bit too, but in Greece, we have several different groups. So for instance, the EAM, we're going to learn some Greek here, you ready? Ethniko Apolothrotiko Metopo. This is the EAM, ELS. This is a group that is communist, right? That group, since Greek independence, was already engaged in a fight against the Republican groups, right? Those democratic groups. We also have the EDES, or the Ethnikos Demokratikos Hellenikos. And this group, again, these are your anti-communist Republican groups, right? So, again, conflicting ideologies already fighting each other. We have the EKKA, the liberal democratic groups, right? The Ethnike Kai Konenike Apollotherosis. I'm going to go ahead and say that. And this group, again, another ideology that is kind of anti-republican, anti-monarchist. We have other groups like our monarchist groups, the PAO. We also have security battalions, right? More localized groups. So all of these groups have different means, different goals in mind, right? And they've been established well before the fascists actually moved into Greece, right? Go ahead, next slide. Now, we also see beyond any true organization with 1942, when they first come in, it's local guerrilla style fighting, right? So regional groups, usually people who don't have any true ideologies, they're just trying to defend their homes, right? So they're trying to organize based on villages and different ethnic groups. Some of them, if you know anything about Greek history, the Klephtic tradition, so these were the groups, the mountainous regions, that actively resisted Ottoman rule whenever it was a thing. And so this is a war that they are used to fighting. This is a tradition that they are used to doing. You also have, again, cooperation that does take place with them, but also as the war especially comes closer to an end, you're going to see these groups actively fight with one another because as they see that there's going to be victory, well, who's going to be in charge? What is this government going to look like afterwards? So we have several leaders, and I just want to kind of show you that the leaders of the different groups, have various backgrounds, right? So we have Aris Veluciotis. He is our ELAS leader, right? He is the one in charge of the communist regime. Grew up in a humble background, but also then eventually moved into Athens and was very active in growing the communist resistance movement prior to the Nazis moving in, and will kind of be seen as that local leader. We also have Theodoros Savelas, who if you know anything about Greek geography, where Epirus is, it's a mountainous region. He, again, kind of unifying local tribes. He's very rustic. He's actually we don't really know his real name. That actually is the name of a Greek hero during the Greek War of Independence. It would kind of be bad if people knew his real name, I guess, if you're in an underground resistance movement. So we have, again, individuals who are in the cities, people who are in rustic areas. We have Manolis Bandouvis, who, again, leads the Cretan resistance. And so I also want to point out, if you know anything about Greek history, yes, they all speak Greek. They all speak the same language. They have similar culture, but that's about it, right? There's just similar to what we see with the United States, right? We have various regions with different cultures, and so the Cretan movement will kind of be doing its own thing, right?
All right, for the French, you have some initial acts of resistance that are very individual. And it takes a little bit, just like you might assume, to get real momentum going. So the first martyr of the German occupation is a farmer named Etienne Avanche, and he will destroy telephone lines and communication lines that connect Bu airfield to the German headquarters. This is the kind of disruption that we're talking about, making it difficult for them to execute plans. But with underground press, you have that almost immediately going on, too. In 1940, you will have Henri Freinet, who is in the military, and he will be captured by the Germans and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany. And he will escape that prisoner of war camp and come back to France, where he will meet with a woman who we will speak about here later, named Bertie Albrecht. And they will establish one of the most famous of all of the underground newspapers, which is called Combat, that you see up here. This is a very iconic image that if you ever read books about the history of France, you will see this image this is a Parisian fighting. And if you know anything about French history, you man the barricades the moment you're about to topple a government. And that's what you see here with these young men. And so they will establish Combat. Has anyone ever heard of Albert Camus? Right? He will take over the Combat. He's a French author, French philosopher, and he will, in 1944, take over the magazine, the Combat. So it is one of the largest of these underground presses. Now, there is a motivation in underground newspapers and underground press because the Nazis are very much sending out propaganda, right? News, information that is from them specifically. They don't want you to know what's happening in conflict around you. They don't want you to know where the Allies are. They are trying to control the narrative. And so what a lot of your underground presses are going to do is they are going to try to counter that propaganda with their own propaganda. Now, there's over 1,200 newspapers, underground newspapers, that will be established throughout France during the occupation. And so you get a variety of things that they're covering. In some towns, they'll give you local news because you're not going to get that local news from the Nazis or even from Vichy, because I know that we're saying they're divided and the South is different, but it's really not. It's just a pretense. Pétain and the Vichys get to exist as long as they do what the Germans say they can do. But a lot of these will do that. They'll give you local news. They'll try to tell you where the Allies are or what's going on regarding the conflict, but they're also trying to counter the propaganda that the Germans are sending out. Now, you might not think it's very dangerous work, but it is, because it's like resources. You can trace resources. And so you need ink, you need paper, you need all these types of mechanisms in order to print these documents. And so when the Germans really start getting desperate, 43 onward, they will really start cracking down. And one way that they will do that is trying to trace where shipments of paper, like if you're ordering a lot of paper, that's going to be noticed, right? And so this is how they're going to end up cracking down. Does anybody know what a mimeograph is? I love this because I know it's probably not any of you. It's a concept of making copies, right? Like carbon copy paper and to ways to make color copies. And so they're mimeographing a lot of these. Some of them are broadsheets, which are just like a front and back type of a handout. Some are more impressive, I guess you could say. So when they first start, I have some numbers because I like to give you the context of how large this will grow. But some of your first newspapers, like you have them taking months just to print 50 copies of a newspaper. You have one group who is using a child's printing press in order to try to create more than one copy. You have handwritten newspapers and press early on until you can get some of this movement. And like Adam was talking about with the Greek resistance, some of these people are building up on things they already are doing. So they're already involved in different organizations, even before fascism was on the rise. You already have writers, typists, people who will bring the skill sets that they have in order to produce these in large number. But these tactics are crucial because this is a way to build patriotism. This is a way to build people to be involved in the movement because not all resistance, as we've talked about, is active. Passive resistance can be the Germans coming up to you and say, did you see anybody nosing around here? And they'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's a form of resistance too. This is where they will also start using women, right? Because women, well, it's misogyny. It's just straight misogyny. The Nazis don't think the women are truly threatening. They don't see them as doing anything nefarious, you know? So like women will move paper and ink and equipment. They will decode message and encode messages. And they will move things in baby carriages or ride bikes around the city or hide cameras and other things in their purses where they can take pictures and things like that. So they use people like that seem non-threatening, or well, it's because of how the Nazis see women, but they will use that to move goods. And as I said, the further we get, the more intense the suppression will be, and the more intense it will be about trying to hunt down the people creating these. These are just a couple other big newspapers. The Humanity is the communist newspaper, and we will talk about the communists later because, like Adam says, in the Greek resistance, there are a lot of factions. And in every one of these resistance groups, the communists are all seen as kind of taboo, if you will. Nobody wants to be involved with them, but they will be crucial to the movement regardless.
With those communist groups, they're like, we definitely don't want them taking over afterwards.
That's right.
So, yes, and we'll even talk about newspapers with the Greek resistance and pamphlets, especially when we get into the discussion about women, but there were other forms of delivering messages, trying to communication networks that existed. So one of the main things that they really relied upon was couriers. Somebody very inconspicuous, right? Maybe, and there are radio broadcasts as well, but those sort of things can be easily picked up by the Nazis. So we have to get really crafty. It's like whenever, do I say sometimes, maybe some students try to get crafty about sharing things so we don't see it during tests. But for instance, loaves of bread. So if you are baking bread, they would bake bread and try to like stuff messages hidden within the loaves of bread. So that way it looks as if it's just something harmless being, sold, traded, so on and so forth. Carving messages into soap bars, right? Not just for sale, but also maybe if you're somebody who's imprisoned and you have a soap bar, you can etch those messages within the soap and then again, have that distributed. And they would even get really crafty with cigarettes, right? Unrolling the paper and actually writing their messages inside the cigarettes and rolling it back up. So that way, whenever those things are sold and or given to prisoners or their family members and so forth, it's something that they're not going to be inspecting right away. But yes, so when we talk about the radios, it does exist. And in fact, the special operations for the British, they are broadcasting messages over the waves, just like we see in France. And I'll kind of show a little hierarchy of how information is disseminated, because the Greeks, they are resisting these individual groups, but they do realize they have to have the help of the Allies coming in, right? And the British are very active within that region. We also see other types of code that was being used, right? This sounds like something that you see on what was it, National Treasure? We actually were joking about that earlier. Using things like lemon juice, right? Writing that on paper so that way individuals can actually see this later, applying heat, because there's a message on the back of the Declaration of Independence, right? Just like the movie said. But one of my favorite too, those mountainous regions. Yes, if you know your Lord of the Rings, that's why I put the beacons are lit, because they would use mirror systems to communicate from mountainous regions from one peak to another, because they're trying to hide that information, but also, has anybody ever been in the mountains? It's a lot of work moving from one place to another. So it's easier just to communicate that with signals using mirrors, right? Also, one interesting thing that we see, the church actively gets involved in this. So the Orthodox Church. Now, I want to highlight that, of course, everyday priests and monks, right, they would offer shelter for people who are trying to flee the authorities. They were really organized in being able to try to smuggle people from one place to another. But we do see other forms of resistance, and it really depends upon your role within the church. For instance, Archbishop Damaskinos Papandreou, he actually, he doesn't really have, on the left-hand side there, he doesn't really have a choice, right? I mean, he can't hide who he is. The Nazis are well aware of his presence, but he is actively going to be, he'll be involved in a more political stance, right? So, for instance, if prisoners or resistance fighters were rounded up, he would be the one going and trying to advocate for their release and or trying to stop their mistreatment through torture, right? There were even times where he was actively threatened by the Nazis and the Italians saying, back off, stay out of this, right? So he had to walk a very fine line. But we also see others too, which actually this one I kind of find interesting over there on the right. So Germanos Demakos, who was a cleric, he was a priest, but he was a part of the communist group, or ELAS, but he was actively fighting. Right? He actually was out there on the front lines with weapons in hand, fighting in these rural areas, sabotaging the German lines and disrupting their supply lines, that sort of thing. So it really, the church kind of took different roles as well. Next one. So when we talk about the communication chain, now again, each individual group, they're not a part of the British, chain of command, but we do see, say, if there's some major operation getting ready to happen, right? So the Allies that are headquartered in Cairo would use radio messages to get that information out, right? And so the groups, like say the Special Operations Executive, the SOE that's in Greece, they would receive that information and then try to get that out to the individual groups that we discussed at the beginning of the Greek overview. So, for instance, you had your regional resistances, right? So the main top dogs within the groups. Then you would say, okay, well, let's disseminate that out to the mountain outposts or the local villages, right? Then those individuals would send it out to your local guerrilla bands, right? The hit and run fighters that were hiding in the mountains. And then you had specific operational units who would then carry out these things like ambushes and destroying communication lines, that sort of thing. Okay, so even though they are separated but they do have a common cause, especially working with the Allies.
If you're curious why the British are involved here, it's because they still have an empire. and they control all of the Mediterranean. And one of the obsessive points is no one needs an outlet in the Black Sea except the British, because that's a threat. I'm just curious if you were like, why are the British hanging out near Greece? It's because the Mediterranean is crucial to their control of the Middle East, their control of the Mediterranean, and even when they do ally with the Soviets, we still don't want the Soviets to have a warm water port in the Black Sea. So that's why Greece does have an interest there. Women are hugely important. And it took a while for people to, or historians, let's say that, to kind of tease them out of the archives and write some kind of expansive works on the activities that women were doing. A lot of it is, as I already mentioned, that they are assumed not to be threatening. But it expands from that. Women they were more likely to convince a German officer if they were captured of their innocence. You have women working in brothels and in houses of ill repute. And that is another way. You use that pillow talk to get information from that German soldier who is coming, for your favors, if you will. You also have things like hiding cameras poking holes in your purse, hiding cameras in your pocket or in your purse. You have women like Lucy Albrecht, who I don't have up here, who will convince the Germans twice to release her husband from prison. One of which will be because she's pregnant and they need to get married. They were already married, right? But it is just this kind that they don't take them seriously, and they will follow kind of what they do. So there's lots of ways that women are going to be used because there is this kind of assumption that they're not going to be a true threat. But I wanted to give you some more specific examples of women's involvement, and we're going to start with Bertie Albrecht, and this is Bertie. Bertie is born in Marseille in the South in 1893. She has a history of being involved in things that might have been considered unacceptable for women in the early 20th century. She's a nurse during World War II. She does get married to a Dutchman and has 2 children, but in the 30s she will leave her husband. They never get divorced. They will just separate, and she will go back to France, and she will start a relationship with Henri Frenet, who I mentioned earlier, and they will start the newspaper Combat. But she's building on things here because she's involved in an organization for human rights. Like, these are things she's done before the war breaks out, before you have this massive rise of fascism. And she will be captured by the Germans multiple times. So she will be captured in November of 1942 in the South because they will move their press and stuff to the South, mostly because it's a lot easier to kind of escape notice. But she will be arrested and she will be put on trial, and this is done by the Vichy government. So it's not necessarily the Germans, but they will put on trial, and then they will send her to a work camp kind of a thing. Bertie will fake mental illness, and they will send her to a psychiatric institution where she will escape that institution at the end of 1942. She will rejoin Henri in the resistance movement, and then in May of 43, she will be betrayed. And that's something that I haven't addressed yet, but you don't know who's loyal to the resistance and who's loyal to the Germans. And it's not even about are you French or not. There are Frenchmen who are loyal to the Germans. There are Frenchmen who are being paid to report on you. And so she will be betrayed by somebody who's made it into the unit, and they will betray her to the Gestapo, which is a separate thing than the Vichy government. The Gestapo is essentially Waffen-SS officers, right? So they will betray her to the Gestapo. She's actually captured, if anyone knows anything about the SS, Klaus Barbie, which is one of the more famous SS Nazis who are going after resistance and kind of weeding people out. And they will try her and take her to what is called Fresnes prison. It's one of the biggest prisons where they take some of these resistance movements. Now, Bertie will be able to, how do you say? I don't want to say fully escape, but she escapes being supervised, and she will die by suicide in 1943. And that is a common thing too, is that you can't, because as 43 on, things are getting rough for the Nazis. And they're getting rough for the Nazis because Hitler has to invade the Soviet Union, right? He needs oil, because he has a mechanized war machine. So he needs to, and so things are getting worse. The Eastern Front is massive casualties, and when I say casualties, dead, missing, or wounded, but in the East, it's largely death. And so this means that German army is not the same level as it has been, because we can create technology and be as fancy militaristically as we like, but the one thing that you always need, no matter what, is manpower. And this is what happens to armies, is you start out with the strongest army, with the best men and the most experienced men, and those men will die. And you cannot replace those men with the same level. They're not going to be experienced. They're going to be new. They're even going to get so desperate that the Germans will start to ground their Luftwaffe, which is their air force, and they will be making pilots join the infantry. They will have POWs join the infantry. And if you think a Pole is going to fight as well for the Germans as a German would, you haven't studied the Second World War very well. So the military itself is not the same. And so they know U.S. is joining the war and things are going to get more desperate. Let me say that. The Germans are going to get more desperate and their actions are going to reflect that. The next one I want to talk about is Alice Artil. And I included her because she's one of the Maquis. She's one of those fighting out in the kind of rural landscape of France. And she actually joins more militant groups. She will actually fight in combat. And so she came from a large family. She is married. Her husband is Raymond Artil. And when the Germans invade France, he will be joining the artillery. The artillery is like your cannons. And he disappears in some of the battles with France. So she spends the first, 1940, 41, and into 42, trying to figure out what has happened to her husband. And she finds out that he is in a camp, a work camp. It's a concentration camp, but concentration camps are largely on the Western Front, and your death camps are in the East. All your death camps are in Poland. So when I say a concentration camp, it doesn't mean it's just like a work camp. Those get pretty severe and pretty bad too. So when she finds out that he's there, she decides she's going to join the resistance. And so she will join some of the Franc Tireur, which is a communist combat regime. So she joins some of those because there is a more militant response to the Germans from your communist groups. And then eventually she will be involved in some of the liberation of some of the major cities in France, and she will actually be recognized for her military combat and receive actual rank in the French military once the war is over. This is Madeleine Riffaut, and she's young. Let's throw a younger person in here. She will move to Paris when she is 18. And when the resistance starts getting going, she will become involved in that. And she will be also arrested, like most of these, by the Germans. And she will escape her capture, but she will be tortured by the Gestapo when she is captured. And when they do this, they want you to name names, right? They want to know, because they're going after the big guys. Your Henri Frenay, that's one reason why they go after Bertie. Is they're hoping that she will give up Henri's location. And that's who they're really trying to take down. So they will torture you, interrogate you, and she resists. She doesn't give up any of her fellow resistors, and she is sentenced to death. She won't actually die. She will very narrowly avoid execution multiple times, and she will be part of a prisoner exchange, which is how she will avoid being executed. And then she will escape and rejoin the resistance, because that is a common theme here. Even with the torture, even with the capture, the moment they're released, and maybe you could think of it as they're even more determined. The stakes are that much higher. So in August of 1944, this is after the Allies have invaded Normandy, because that is what's going to really create a renewed resistance because now we have military combat. Now the Allies too, by the way, in the rural areas, like with the McKee, they're dropping military equipment in the middle of nowhere for these resistance groups to grab. You also have any Allied aircraft that is downed over France. The resistors will try to get to them before the Germans do. And so they will end up joining resistance movements as well and bring their own military expertise to some of that. And so in August of 44, she's 20. It was her 20th birthday. She will lead an assault on a German armored train. She will capture over 80 enemy soldiers, and she will win rank of lieutenant in the French Forces of the Interior. The French Forces of the Interior are the name that de Gaulle gives to all the resistance fighters because he's trying to, you know, he wants to be president of France. Let's be honest, he wants to capitalize on that. But that's the name he gets her. So this is Madeleine. She's very young, and yet she accomplishes quite a lot. This is Claire Chevron, and she is a Jew. She was what you would call an assimilated Jew, meaning that she's probably not practicing Judaism. People are probably not fully aware that she is Jewish, assimilating to French culture. And she has her code name. Well, Madeleine's code name is Rainier, after one of her favorite poets. And Claire's code name is Christine Clauet. And she will be a messenger. She will do a lot of decoding and coding of messages for the resistance. She will eventually be captured because she too is betrayed by someone else, and she will be imprisoned for 4 months by the Gestapo. Now, for Christine Clauet, that's her code name, you can actually read her memoir of her experiences. You can read also Lucy Albrock, who gets her husband out of jail by saying she's pregnant and she needs to be married. Hers is called Outwitting the Gestapo. So there's a lot of memoirs from some of these women who do survive on what their experiences are. And so the only one of this group, because I didn't want to depress you too much, who does not survive is Bertie. But she was hardcore. Bertie was hardcore. They were going to take her down.
Okay, and much of these have already been kind of highlighted with roles that women had played in resistance movements. And just like in France, Greece also utilized women in sabotage as well as delivering messages and so forth. So again, we see the roles varying, right? You have them acting as couriers, at times they're medics, they're actively fighting. You can find images of them actually taking up arms. They're saboteurs and organizers trying to get various groups to work together. And again, this spans not just within cities. You see them actively participating in rural areas and mountainous regions. So again, this is a widespread phenomenon with women actively working to resist. Also, you see various organizations that they are actively involved in. For instance, the EPON, again, the youth movement. So many of them are teachers, and when they're awake, we can influence students to do some things, right? So also we see groups like the EAM, again, they're working as social workers, they're working with the politics there. They actively are involved in the Red Cross. So again, similar to what we see with France, they're involved in various roles. Can you go ahead? We're going to highlight a few individuals here. Go ahead, one more, I'm sorry. So this is Leila Karagiani. She actually was a leader of the Bubalina cell in Athens. Again, this particular group, kind of an offshoot of the EAM. And for her, she was mostly active in running kind of like underground, sabotage networks, as well as helping people escape, right? If for some reason you were on the Nazis list and they got word that you were the person that was getting ready to be picked up by the SS, she would be the one that would try to get you to the safe houses, right? She was, forging documents, for instance, because again, most in Nazi-controlled territories, you had to have some sort of documentation on you. So again, work papers, ID cards. This also goes over for their Jewish comrades as well, trying to get them smuggled out so that way they don't end up in concentration camps or death camps. You also see them actively providing disguises for people. So again, groups that were oftentimes usually left alone, even though there was some suspicion, but like priests and nuns and so forth. They also would, again, train the teenagers, right? Since they are teachers, they have direct access to teenagers who, again, most of the time, the Nazis are not going to look at kids and think, oh, that's a potential threat. Not saying that they were completely ignorant to the fact, but they're teaching them how to run these supply networks, how to get people from one place to another. So, for instance, you might get some sort of message saying, hey, this kid is going to meet you at this location. They're going to take you to this point, and there you go. So that way she doesn't have a direct hand in it, right? And she also, again, will be a part of some sabotage networks as well. So, for instance, destruction of some supply depots, right? Or maybe she's, analyzing troop movements and getting that information out to other networks, right? Military infrastructure, where are the troops? Where, what garrisons are stationed in Athens or around Athens? She will eventually be caught and she'll be sent to the Hadari concentration camp. And I know that's something that most people don't think about, is there are actual concentration camps within Greece. This is a suburb of Athens, and there she will be tortured and eventually executed. But the thing is that she will not give up her comrades, right? As was pointed out with the French. They're trying to find out who are the other people involved. She refused to give them up. Next. So also we have some celebrities involved in this as well. So Sophia Vimbo, for instance, she was a very famous singer even prior to the invasion. She actually will actively use her wealth to try to support these resistance movements, right? Funneling that into these areas. She also, not only in aiding the army, but she'll also contribute food, medicine, other things to help these various groups, these that are actively resisting. But she's also known for boosting morale, right? So various songs, right? Even if it's not reporting troop movements, even if it's not an active, we're sending messages about this, supply drop coming in. Just singing songs to inspire people, to boost morale, to keep them wanting to fight. So, for instance, one of them, Children of Greece Children, right? This is a tribute to Greek soldiers to inspire them. You also see You'll Never Make It to Athens. This is one actively taunting Mussolini in the fascist invasion. And even afterwards, she's going to be very active in, trying to help Greece after it was torn by war, and actively involved in the politics and trying to, promote Greek nationalism, right, to try to ensure that they're not falling into the wrong hands afterwards. Next. We also have Hara Limniadi. She too also was a courier, and what was interesting about hers as well is, again, I love just the issues with disguises, right? When she was captured, again, she was actively imprisoned and tortured at times, and eventually her network was able to save her because she was disguised as a nurse and was able to escape imprisonment. Is this one missing? Hello? Okay. And again, she's going to be also actively in organizing messages and trying to get various information out to other groups. Again, thank you. Back to those teachers. So Maria Tanu, for instance, one of those teachers, they have access to these young folk. We talked earlier with the French resistance about newspapers and pamphlets, right? The written word. Now that one is a little more dangerous because, again, that leaves behind evidence for people to find. But we do see that they are actively trying to show the atrocities that the Greeks are actually committing in other parts of Greece, trying to get this information out to the general public in Greece and also beyond. For instance, one of these, known as the People's Voice, this was the official publication of the Communist Party. Now, this was something that existed prior to the resistance movement, and of course it just takes on the role of helping get that information out during occupation. You also see one known as the New Generation. This was a youth paper, and again, the whole goal was to get students and young workers actively involved in the resistance, right? Trying to promote the, hey, come join our side, be a part of our active resistance. You also, again, another one, the People's Victory. She will also be actively involved in student protests. For instance, one at the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. And also, she will be involved in smuggling out coded information from people who were actively imprisoned as well. So, very active individual, right? Next. But this one, I get really excited, and I think Dr. Wisely is going to get really excited about this as well. So this individual, so Ellie Papadimitriou, she actually was a member and an activist in these one of the resistance groups, and prior to her role in the resistance, she loved to document people's lives, right? Photographing, as you kind of see here, and it kind of cuts off one of the shepherds, but just documenting everyday life in the rural countryside, right? Photographing and so forth. But during this, she also was active in helping smuggle coded messages in the resistance. For instance, textbooks, right? She would take an everyday plain religious book, or it might be a school book, something that was just unassuming, right? Didn't have any title on it that might tip the Nazis to think, oh, there's something suspicious about this, like very democratic or communist in nature. But she would actually remove the binding, would take out certain pages, and then she would put secret messages in there, then take glue and re-seal that up, right, and rebind it. Now, of course, if you're a Nazi, you're, say you're at a checkpoint or whatever, and you look and it's like, okay, geometry, whatever, right, go on through. Not even suspecting that she had some coded messages within there, right? But one of the reasons why she is very important is because even the very nature of resistance movements, right, it's clandestine. It's very hard to find sources for that. As historians, there's so many things we would love to know, but it's just top secret in nature. But she actually went around and actually preserved the testimonies of various groups, preserved the testimonies of people who experienced atrocities, but also these resistance fighters, using things like oral histories. Hey, Dr. Wisely, you like that, huh? It's not like she's trying to start an oral history project here on campus or anything. But this, right, again, of course, it's important for their nation, it's important for their movement, but it is a treasure trove for historians to be able to look at this and say, okay, so now we kind of have an idea of how these, so how do we know they're using things like bread? How do we know they're, smuggling textbooks and so forth with coded messages? This is how. Next. But I also want to highlight other, not just individuals, but one significant event was the Women's March in Athens in 1943. So word had gotten out that the Nazis were going to conscript men to labor camps. Well, this just completely, upset people, of course, because what's going to happen to them afterwards? And what we see is actually thousands of unarmed women, right? Not, resistance fighters that have firearms, that sort of thing. They actually go out and actively protest. For instance, they're blocking roads. They're going past tanks. Armed soldiers. I'm just curious, and it makes me think of this movie. Have y'all seen V for Vendetta at all? So that very end, right, if you haven't seen it by now, and if I spoil it for you, I'm sorry, it's your own fault. You should have seen it by now. It's been out for a while. But this part where they're pushing past, like they all show up, they're protesting, and they're at the checkpoint, and they just blow right past those soldiers. It's kind of the same thing. In fact, what was so interesting about this is they overwhelm these checkpoints. They seize several of their buildings, right? And in this, they're shouting things like, "We gave our sons to the war. We won't give them to German factories." This was so successful that actually the Nazis rescinded the order, and not a shot was fired, which is impressive. Actually, Professor Stewart and I were talking about this beforehand, because the Greeks women have a history in Greece of having being very vocal, and also being defiant at times whenever there are issues. Like, for instance, if you know ancient history, like,
History of the
Professor Reed, like
Peloponnesian
the
War.
Lysistrata, right? If you know that story from classical Greece, again, trying to end the Peloponnesian War, and women are actively involved in trying to get men to stop this fighting. And so you see here a commemoration of this event. This is actually in the 1980s. You can't find images of the actual protest because, well, why would you take pictures and then the Nazis find out you took pictures of them looking like fools later, and then you end up in a concentration camp? So, again, this is something from the 1980s, but again, a very, very, very significant deal. So, go ahead.
We're running out of time here because we want to give you your chickens. So we're going to go through this fairly quickly. In France, you also have Jewish resistance, like French Jews. And you have obviously Jewish resistance everywhere, okay? More armed combatant resistance in Eastern Europe. But in France, they have organizations that already exist. And largely, the French Jews will use these organizations to counterfeit information. And they will be part of a much larger system that is called the Kindertransport. Kinder is German for child, and this is how do we get Jewish children off the continent. And this is all. Parents are being sent to death camps, and they want their kids to survive. So there is an underground movement of getting kids off the continent. This is a group of children that the Jews will save. Another thing, because there's quite a few in Greece, and we'll talk about them really quick, and I think this is more common on the Eastern Front than the Western Front, is massive massacres of people who are part of the resistance. So I'm going to quickly let Professor Guerrero talk about some of the massacres in Greece, and then I'll give you an example, but it's more end of the war desperation for France.
Thank you. And one of the reasons why I chose Greece, again, is the level of violence that you see to try to end these resistance movements, as Professor Stewart was talking about. You kind of see a difference, right, in the West. And I'm not trying to downplay what they experience, the violence,
It's bigotry, though. There is a hierarchy of whiteness in Europe.
Yes.
And your Slavic countries and your Eastern European countries are considered to be a lower level of white. All right. The Germans hate the French. They're hundreds and hundreds of years old enemies, but there's a different relationship between those two nations.
Absolutely. If you'll go ahead and show, and again, and I know these things can be kind of troubling, but if you go around in various parts of Greece, you will find memorials, you'll find inscriptions, right, the names of people who were lost. For instance, one of these at Distomo, in fact, this very site was the reason why I chose to bring up this topic. When having gone and seen this myself, so up in this mountainous region, just as we've been talking about, guerrilla fighters are harassing the German supply lines, they're attacking them, and, well, you can't find them. They're in the mountains, they're well hidden. So what did the Nazis do? They come in and round up 218 civilians and execute them all. The victims were not just the men in the village, the remaining men, but also women and children, right, the elderly. And this, again, is probably one of the most infamous war crimes that they committed. In fact, and I don't know if y'all remember in 2010 when Greece was getting ready, it was about to go bankrupt, they were trying to get Germany to help bail them out and the rest of Europe, and Germany was saying, no, we don't need to do that. And all the Greeks had to say was, hey, do y'all remember Distomo? And they're like, hey, we should help the Greeks out, yes. And what's impactful is when you walk into this site, they have a mausoleum with all the skulls of the victims. And to walk in and see skulls of not just adults, but also children, that it hits you, right? We see some survivors saying here, they killed my entire family. I hid under the bodies to survive. I was only a child. Next. We also see at Calavitra, kind of same thing, right? 500 men and boys were executed. Again, a survivor says, the school was burning. We could hear the screams. We knew we were next because after they executed the men, they took all the women and children and put them in a church and then set it on fire. Next. In Comino, same thing. 317 villagers, including women and infants, were killed. They lined up the villagers and started shooting. No one was spared, not even the babies. And then finally, you see here about 20 villages in this one region. Again, because of the resistance fighters, they just start massacring people in this region in Vianos. Again, entire areas were destroyed. And you see a survivor says here, they came at dawn and began killing without warning. I watched them execute my father. So again, widespread violence that took place, all because they're trying to suppress this resistance movement that was taking place at this time.
An example of a massacre in France is the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre. And you see it's 4 days after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The resistance gets a lot of momentum, as you might expect, once the Allied troops are landed. And so they are going to capture one of the officers of the German, the Waffen-SS, Helmut, I can't remember his last name, and they execute him. And so in retaliation, the Germans are going to destroy this village in France, and they will kill 642 civilians. These are all non-combatants, men, women, and children. And this is what it still looks like. You can visit the village. The French decide that they will not rebuild on the same site. They do rebuild the village. It's just not on top of where it already existed, because where it exists, it becomes a memorial. We have to wrap it up. Our Professor Reed keeps us all on track.
Sadly, there's so
so
much more
we'll
we could
end
say.
On a horrible note. Maybe we should have started with the massacres and ended on more a positive, but
Hey,
we'll stop with
the
that.
Allies do win the war, so I mean, there is that.
That's
right?
true.
Oh yeah, they win. Woo!
So, woo! All right, thank you again to Professor Stewart and Professor Guerrero.
We got Professor Elkins drawing names.
All right.
If you want seconds, get more
Yes,
pizza.
definitely go get pizza,
Get more
but
pizza.
wait
We
for
have some
chickens.
left.
That's the high note. More pizza. Go.
Wait for chickens. Samantha,
wait for
you want to?
You had the whole
We've
time
got
to
it. We've
prepare.
got it. All right. Oh, perfect. Okay. I'll call them out and you hand
We're
it.
gonna throw chickens
So-
at you.
Okay. So our first chicken winner